Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, May 21st, 2024. Tonight, we're going to be talking about co-parenting. And if I might indulge myself just a little bit, if you'll allow me this, yesterday was the marriage of my first daughter, my second child. In fact, it was officiated by my first child, my oldest, my son Jake. And yesterday was their marriage to Jordan. Jordan and Emma June is the name that they've chosen to embark on their new life. They've chosen a name that's neither of their last names that represents something meaningful to them. But at any rate, um, I just want to share with you as we begin tonight's broadcast on co-parenting that one of the many highlights of the entire day, and there were so many I could talk about it for hours, was the time when my wife and my ex-wife, Emma's mother, were dancing together for about 5 minutes, and just the absolute closeness that she and I have, and that we have with her. In fact, she's getting married in a couple of weeks, and we are on a very short list of people that are invited because that's how close we become. The reason I tell this personal story and the reason it's relevant to tonight's topic is if you had gone back 20 years or so, you would have never believed that the story would end up this way. You would never have predicted that there would be this kind of closeness and intimacy. In fact, when she was dating her now fiance, one of the things that she said was she wanted us to meet him because we are family. We matter so much to her, and meeting him and him meeting us was so important on that next step of her journey. So as I reflect back tonight, if I'd given this broadcast, and I have given this broadcast more than once, but if you were listening to me give this broadcast 15 or 20 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to speak from such a felt sense of what the work can do and how people can change. And part of the thought with this, as I give you this long lead in for this evening, is the key to co-parenting. No matter if you're the parent who feels like you're pulling most of the weight and the other parent's sabotaging things, or you're just at odds with how to approach things, or the other person's not following through, or your co-parent, whether married or not to you, is kind of like your other child, and they're not doing their work and don't understand what the work is when we talk about the work. Um, the key to it all is you've got to keep growing. You've got to keep changing. You've got to keep learning. I sat at the wedding party last night. I sat next to my therapist. We talked about this a little bit. She was invited because she's also my daughter's therapist. And we talked about this idea about even in her at her advanced age, the thing that she most enjoys is learning new things. And she happens to be, from my vantage point, the smartest person, the most educated person that I've ever known in this field. Written somewhere around 40 or 50 books at this point in her career. So I just wanted to share that little personal tidbit. I've been crying this morning. I cried all day yesterday. My eyes are puffy, but I'm excited to get on with tonight's broadcast. I do want to make one announcement before I lead in to the content of the main content that I prepared for you this evening. Something that we're doing different now is that all wilderness families, all wilderness parents, current parents, are now invited to, as a part of their child's stay, to attend an online intensive. And to be clear, this is not an intensive where you're going to talk a lot about your child. This is an intensive where you're going to be talking about and doing your own therapy. You're going to be talking about the child that lives inside of you, your own inner child. And this is really the first half of what the in-person intensive looks like, where we go back and we understand the soup that we were cooked in, the air that we breathed as children. And we provide that experience. We go back into that experience therapeutically, and the people that are in attendance get to be witnesses to that, get to reflect back what it saw, what it looked like, what it felt like for them to watch what your childhood seemed to feel like, seemed to be. So we think the research is absolutely consistently clear on this fact that the best investment you can make in your parenting, the best investment you can make in your marriage or in your co-parenting relationship or virtually any aspect of your life, the best investment is understanding yourself. One of my favorite quotes from Shams Tabrizi, the spiritual teacher of Rumi, is where he says that all the prophets agree on one thing, and that is get a mirror, look at yourself. So finding you is that opportunity. It's now included for all of our wilderness parents as a part of their enrollment, their process. So June 21st is that next online. It's a Friday afternoon to a Sunday evening, and that way you, if work and finances and time are at a premium for you, this is how we make it most accessible for you. If you want to attend an in-person intensive, and June is almost full, June has one more spot open. If you want to attend an in-person intensive instead, and you're a current alum, or your current wilderness parent, you can apply the cost of that program toward the in-person. So if that's your desire, and you do it while your child is in the program, then you are welcome to attend the in-person. And then, of course, we have the New York City intensive that I'll be running. The only time that I'll be running Finding You for 2024 is July 31st through August 4th, near New York City. So if you live in the tri-state area, if you've thought about attending an intensive, or if you want to visit New York City and want to combine a vacation and a visit to Broadway with doing some of your own work, July 31st through August 4th, join me, and I will look forward to working with you. Contact intensives at evoketherapy.com for any of the things I'm talking about. One of my favorite ideas is something that was shared by Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell, for those of you that don't know, is somebody who studied mythology. And he has a very close relationship with Carl Jung in terms of their overall philosophy about how mythology, stories that we tell, stories that endure, stories that are shared and that attract people, tell us about ourselves. We realize I'm in the middle of actually listening to the Iliad, which has just been released by somebody who I read her translation, Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey a couple of years ago, and it was absolutely beautiful and life changing. And I'm reading the Iliad, and when I'm reading it and listening to it, I'm listening to it. Audrey McDonald is the speaker. When I'm listening to it, I I I feel connected to history. I feel connected because the stories and the themes, and Emily Wilson does such a fantastic job of teaching you what to listen for, what to look for, what it means before she starts her translation, that you realize that it's the same stories. It's the same thing that people are dealing with today. One of my very favorite ideas in doing psychotherapy is when I share a quote or an idea written long before the session at hand with a client, long before maybe even I've even met them. But when I can share something with them that was written, years ago or long before I met them, it to me signals to them that they're not alone, that others have been through this before. So Joseph Campbell shared a lot of psychological, spiritual wisdom in the context of mythology. And in James Hollis's book, The Eden Project, In Search of the Magical Other, which is my favorite book on coupleship, a really powerful, honest, a raw look at the psychology of coupleship. Um, James Hollis shared this quote from Joseph Campbell. He said, I think one of the problems in marriage is that people don't realize what it is. They think it's a long love affair, and it isn't. Marriage has nothing to do with being happy. It has to do with being transformed. And when the transformation is realized, it is a magnificent experience. But you have to submit. You have to yield. You have to give. You can't just dictate. I know this quote is talking about marriage, and we're not quite talking about marriage tonight. We're talking about the co-parenting relationship. That last phrase, "you can't just dictate," is to me the real wisdom of this quote, the greatest wisdom of this quote. That one of the most difficult things about a partnership, any kind of partnership, where power is shared, right? Not one person has power over the other, is that you have to work through it. I know some of you have heard the idea, and I've heard it said to me many times, that when two people come to a negotiation in business, one of the signs that it's a good negotiation, a fair negotiation, is both parties walk away feeling like the other person got a better deal. So as I started off tonight talking about co-parenting and the years of work that it took to get to this place for me and my co-parent, part of that is our individual work, our growth. And the people we are today wouldn't even be able to relate in some ways, or at least on a day-to-day basis, wouldn't be able to relate to the people that we were 20 years ago. I always say that if you're the same person today that you were 10 or 20 years ago, or if you're the same person in 10 or 20 years from now than you are today, then you've probably wasted 10 or 20 years. You have to unlearn, you have to evolve, you have to mature. I think the greatest threat to any of our work is to come to the idea or the conclusion that you've arrived, that you've figured it out, that you have all the answers and that they're clear. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges in co-parenting and some thoughts that might be helpful for you in navigating what can be a very difficult decision. I'm not going to distinguish throughout my presentation today. I'm not going to distinguish between whether or not you're married to your co-parent or not. I would imagine intimacy and co-parenting quality is on a continuum that transcends marriage. There are people that I've worked with who are not married, who are fantastic co-parents with each other, and there are people that I've worked with that are married that absolutely struggle with the task of co-parenting. So, independent of marriage, I'm going to be talking about co-parenting. The first thing that I've talked about, and I wrote this a long time ago before I saw the fruits of what I described at the outset of tonight's broadcast, is you're in it for the long game. I think one of the barriers, one of the ways to reduce creativity and flexibility and awareness and insight is the pressure of time, the pressure of an outcome. It has to be now. Today it is live or die, pass or fail, all or nothing. And in parenting, it really is the long game. In fact, if I were to meet the person that I was 30 years ago, 31 years ago, when my first child was born, I would have so much compassion and sympathy for that young person because he had no idea what parenting would be, how it would transform him and his wife. So we play the long game, and there are going to be seasons. There are going to be winter seasons in our journey where things aren't going our way and things are scaring us, and we imagine that all is lost. And the only thing that I know about psychotherapy is you just got to keep going. Just keep going. No matter what the question, the dilemma is in your life, just keep going. And so my first idea is it's the long game that matters. And I will tell you, the parent that I am today, what I saw yesterday at the wedding of my daughter that I attended, the closest in the relationship that I have with my four children would not have been possible. The closest I had with their mother, my two oldest with their mother, would not have been possible had I not continued to work and to grow. And I would say the same about her. So it's the long game. And I've built a relationship later in life where I have failed, where I've come up short. I know that sometimes people present issues where they worry that the other person is so off target in their parenting approach that they think that it might require or justify legal involvement, like custody changes or child abuse reporting. And I will just say, without going into those, because those are real, if you think that is what applies to you, if you think that things are so far off track that some kind of legal intervention, whether it be custody or whether it be reporting child abuse, talk to a lawyer. Know what your rights are. Know what rises to the level of legal intervention. I will tell you that in some cases, many cases, when parents have thought that it was so far off that it justified the idea of, for example, changing the custody agreement, it often doesn't, and at least you have that answer. And in cases where it does justify that, then do what you need to do to protect your child and do what's best for them. I used to think a lot, when you I have a PhD in marriage and family therapy, and when you're studying in those early years and they're teaching co-parenting, what most of the books say are that parents have to be unified and on the same page. And that's a nice idea. That's a really nice idea. And if somehow that could happen in all cases, I'm sure it would smooth things out greatly for everybody. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think it's realistic to think about parents being on the same page. I think it's important to be respectful. I think it's important to be overt about it. I think it's important to talk about it amongst the co-parenting team. But you can have different rules. You can have different values. You can have different culture. For better and worse and everything in between, I would say that my two oldest children, their mother is my ex-wife, that that there was a very different culture, and it wasn't all better at our house. There were things about my wife's house and household that I look up to and saw the impact on my children being a very positive one. And so I think we get to bring, even if we're married, we get to bring our co-parenting differences to the table. Even with my wife, who I'm still actively co-parenting my youngest, who still lives in the home of the 4 children. Um, we have differences. We have differences in what we will allow. We have to come to some consensus on the big items, on the big decisions. But when it comes to just being with her and way of being, we honor each other's differences. We honor each other's strengths. We have compassion. One of my greatest accomplishments as a co-parent is when I have been patient with watching, observing my wife parent in a way that didn't align with the way that I saw things, and have been able to approach her with compassion and non-judgment and patience, because that's what I want. That's what I want and need from my co-parent is I need patience. And if I'm doing it wrong, I don't, and most human beings don't respond well to the direct message of you're doing it wrong. It tends to, and I can say this with a big smile, it tends to, and what I mean by that is almost always, it tends to lead to defensiveness. And it comes from a place of judgment. And it creates more and more division. So you can be different and you can talk about it, and they can be different. And there'll be things that they're doing that you might even believe years later. And this is true in my co-parenting journey. There are things that each of us did that at the time we disagreed with the other person's approach, that now I agree with it. Now I see its wisdom. So being on the same page might look and sound great in a parent therapy book, but I just don't see it the way that I did when I was younger. Sometimes they would talk about when they were training us that when you have co-parents or people that are working on the same thing, that you don't really entertain separate conversations with them. I believe just the opposite. I believe sometimes you have to have separate phone calls, especially where there's so much acrimony, so much conflict, such a high conflict situation, that if I'm talking to a father, for example, and trying to coach him about how to co-parent, how to parent, an idea, maybe even touching on in ways that he's struggled and hasn't unraveled his own trauma history, I don't think that's a safe thing to do in front of his ex-partner, his ex-spouse, his co-parent. I think that can be very threatening. So, even though the books say don't take calls from people in situations like this, don't have sessions separate from each other, I actually not only endorse, but actually encourage and ask for. I want to hear. I will say to couples in even in just couples therapy, I will say, tell me what you would want to tell me, but you would be afraid to say or uncomfortable to say in front of your partner. I want to know the truth about the way that you look at the world in this relationship. Now, at Evoke, we do try to have most of the parenting update phone calls with everybody together because we want you to hear the same thing. We want the same message to be clearly communicated about the work that your child is doing, the therapy that they're doing, and what is needed. But there are, of course, options. There are other situations. There are other conversations that can be had separately. In fact, can even be helpful. Speaking about co-parenting, the first thought that I have is it's important for you, especially if you're listening to this or watching this live, go to therapy. Help you deal with the hurt and the anger that you feel toward your co-parent. If you don't deal with it, it will inevitably show up and it will leak. It will come out sideways. And I would say, even with my wife, with whom I'm happily married, part of what I do in therapy is I bring something that's troubling me about our relationship, about her, about some dynamic to my therapist. I bring that to my therapist. Sometimes that's as far as it goes. Sometimes that's the only, in my opinion, the only appropriate place for that specific conversation to be had. And I can work through it, even see my part in it. And sometimes that's a precursor to me going back and having a conversation with my wife. But the point of this idea is that it's really important, because if you don't go to therapy, if you don't own your anger, your hurt, your pain, the proverbial water under the bridge, it will be more likely to unconsciously come out when you interact with your child. You'll end up parenting your child, whether you're married or not, to correct the other parent. Or what I found out during our separation was I realized that a lot of the parenting decisions I was making at one point were to make my wife happy. I was really taking care of her, and I lost my own voice. I didn't I was less of a parent because I was unconsciously trying to settle and deal with her anxiety or her fears in the way that I was parenting. And what that would look like sometimes is it would look like a lot harsher, a lot less compassionate. Definitely. And most importantly, a lot less clarity in seeing my child and what was going on with them. You're going to have to let go of some things. Right? This is part of the energy that I started tonight's broadcast with. You're going to have to submit. You can't just dictate. You have to yield. You have to work through it. You have to let go. And probably the biggest problem I see in co-parenting dynamics, or the thing that comes up maybe most commonly when there's a problem, is the obsession with focusing on the limitations, the mistakes, the approach of the co-parent. To me, the word obsessing is important. To me, when I'm obsessing about somebody, when I'm having conversations in my head, when I'm winning arguments or coming up with a comeback, trying to convince somebody of something, sell them on something, so somehow reach them or change them. When I'm obsessing about the other person, in this case, the co-parenting, I am in my codependency. I am in my own disease. I'm in my unhealed work. I'm not operating from my highest, wisest self. So if you're constantly thinking about how poorly your co-parent is parenting, how poorly they're showing up, how little of the work that they're understanding and doing when we talk about child psychology and child development, that's an indication, in my opinion, that there's more work to be done. You have to get to a place. It's not that you don't care. It's not that you never have a difficult discussion or try to negotiate some kind of approach. It's not that. It's just that if you focus on the other person and their change, the issues will be about you. We'll be talking about, or not talking about, which is maybe even worse. We'll be talking about you and your issues. I talk about this idea of go more than halfway. People will say marriage or co-parenting is a 50-50 deal. You have to meet the other person halfway. I don't believe in meeting other people halfway. I believe you got to meet people all the way. People that espouse the idea of meeting the co-parent or their partner halfway, what inevitably ends up happening is they end up arguing about this distance that still exists between them and the other person. They imagine they've gone halfway, and maybe it's just 48 or 49%. And the other person imagines that they've gone halfway, but they've only gone 48% also. And people end up arguing about that 4% that separates them. So you have to go farther. And again, I'm not going to get very specific in a lot of my instruction this evening because this broadcast wouldn't be very helpful 2 years from now if I did. It already is gonna be need to be done in 2 years because I suspect I'm gonna learn new things in a couple of years. But these principles are fundamental. I know that one of the things that I was angry about growing up, I happened to be a child of divorce, and one of the things that I was angry about as a child was what I called at the time the hypocrisy of my parents, their inability to get along with each other in a pretty significant way. I think that's part of what made me a good therapist in the early days was I could focus on two extremely different opinions, two people that I care about, two people in the case of my childhood that I needed, and I could see things from both perspective that predisposed me as a therapist to doing this kind of systems-based work, couples work. But the thing that I would tell you about that tonight is if you're struggling with your co-parent, what hope do you have? And this is not an accusatory question. The question is real for you to ask yourself, what hope do you have in trying to model, to have empathy for your child and the struggles that they have with you or in relationship. And for those of us that have struggled in marriage and co-parenting relationships at a significant level, ideally, what would come out of that is some kind of humility, some kind of increased compassion, not just for ourselves, but for our children as they struggle to navigate relationships with teachers or other adults or us or their peers. Sometimes I've seen a lot of success with this next idea. I just call it let them try it. If you become so sure that your way, if I co-parented with my, I'm 56 today, right now. If I co-parented at 56 with my 36-year-old self, we would have not been on the same page. We would have saw things so differently. He would have thought I was an idiot, although there's a secret wish that I think I could have convinced him. But just upon first blush, he would have thought that I was an idiot, and I would have thought that he was an idiot. So sometimes you have it might work to just let them try it. If they have a different approach and it goes contrary to yours, and I've done this with my co-parents, is I've let them try it their way. Because one of the things I've talked about in the last couple episodes that I've been thinking about lately, and that's the way these things go for me. I'm just really doing my own work and doing my own thinking and my own writing all the time. And what comes out of that work, that focus is what I bring to these. But what I realize is you've got to keep learning. The only disaster is when you stop learning and stop growing and stop evolving and stop changing. And with that, what I feel and believe more and more as I get older is I don't know. I don't know the right answers. I'm glad tonight is not a Q&A. We'll have one on Thursday if there are any questions left over. But part of the questions that I get asked, part of my answer would be I don't know the right thing to do or the best thing to do or what will work. In fact, all of those questions have in them a flaw in the first place, that there is a right way, and that parenting or coupleship or relationships are about controlling for outcomes versus the way I see it, which is showing up and being your most authentic self, the most you're capable of, first and foremost, and then secondly, being able to hold space and compassion for somebody else's humanness. Right, those are the two key tasks. But it's really important in my experience from spiritual and emotional development to not know so much, to not have all the answers. And I'm learning that still. I've received that feedback, especially from my wife over the years, that I'm too certain, that I talk at times as if I know the answers. And I'm painfully and sometimes in some cases with great humiliation at the failure and the arrogance and the ego that I have, I'm realizing I don't have all of the absolute answers. So letting them try it speaks to that idea and I have seen people, and I would put myself in that category in many cases. I have seen people do the unorthodox thing to go against what even the experts were telling them to do. And I have seen that work out better than I would have ever predicted. Don't correct or talk with your children about the negative stuff said about you. It's really important to do as little of this as possible, especially if you're new to therapy, because you will leak. You're not the best person to vent to. For your child to come to you and say, mom or dad or the other parent is XYZ or doing XYZ, and I really, can't stand it. I'm really angry. You're at a disadvantage because you have a dog in the fight. You have an agenda that is beneath or behind it all, which is you have your own frustrations, your own ego in this discussion about you being right and you doing it the right way. So I would tread very, very carefully. And by the way, all that I'm talking about tonight, you have failed at some of this and you will fail at it going forward. Maybe it's a simple example to share this, but it's true. I just shared it last night when I was talking to somebody at the wedding party that I was at with my family from my son-in-law's side of the family. We were talking about the work that I do. I said, when a parent comes to me and said, I was a really good parent, or I'm a really good parent, or I'm a good parent, I really worry about the child in those cases. Really worry about the child. When somebody comes to me and says, I've made lots of mistakes, I have fumbled and screwed up a lot, I have a great deal of hope for the child and their development. This is an impossible thing to do, parenting. It is impossible to get it right. I was sharing with these same folks. They asked me if the couple had considered children and if they talked about that. I said, yeah, I've talked with them about. They've talked with me about it on a few occasions, and I shared some kind of funny anecdotes about our conversation. And I shared the story that my daughter came to me a few years ago, and she said, "Do you think it's possible to be a master therapist and to not have children?" She said to me, and I said, "I suppose it is, but it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard to be a master therapist to if you don't have children." Because there's nothing so important that you will fail at more. There's nothing that will require your expansion and growth more for it to be anywhere near successful. You cannot not dent your children. You cannot not do that. All you can do is work on yourself, work on repair, keep trying, keep going. And it is through that failure, the greatest obstacle to growth for anybody with a mental health issue is success. Success is the greatest barrier to somebody learning and growing. Failure is necessary, and there's nothing more important. There's just nothing more important in our lives than parenting. There are probably a couple of things that come right up close to it, or maybe are tied with it, but I can't think of anything more sacred than the task, the role, the relationship of parenting. So you will fail at this stuff, and it's important for you to know that. Because if you believe the illusion that you're getting it right and that you're not failing, when I believe the illusion that I'm following all the rules that I'm going to share you, all the principles and guidelines that I'm discussing, that's when my parenting really suffers. That's when my own spiritual growth really suffers. Try to be a safe person for your kid. Try to be the adult. Remember, this relationship is not a two-way street in a lot of cases, a lot of situations. This relationship, the parent-child relationship, is in many aspects a one-way street. You are the adult. They are the child. In fact, when I was in graduate school, we had somebody from the sheriff's office come and talk to us about child abuse and child abuse reporting laws. And the thing that he said that was consistent with all the child abuse that he had observed in his career up to that point was that the parent had expectations that the child behave at a developmentally more mature level than the child was capable of operating, of living, of being. We have to be the adult. We don't get our needs taken care of in the context of the parent-child relationship that we want sometimes. Parenting is hard. It's impossible. You deserve compassion. And on top of that compassion, you deserve more compassion as a parent. All of you do, all of you listening to me, absolutely deserve that. And part of what you need to understand that it's okay that human beings screw up, that we mess up. And the only hope that we have in our lives, and especially in this sacred relationship, is the strength, the courage to see that, to own where we come up short, to own our part of it. So be a safe person by your kid for doing your work, by having self-awareness. The more you lack in self-awareness, the more abusive you'll be to your child. The more you think that your needs are supposed to be met in the parenting relationship, the more your child will suffer. Parenting is the most painful, difficult, along with marriage, thing that I've ever engaged in my life. Everything outside of those relationships is tremendously easier. And they are the two things that have given me the most meaning by a long shot. And that's, I would have said that last week or years ago, but with the tender and recent memory of watching my son officiate and marrying my daughter to somebody who's become one of, if not my closest friend yesterday, it's I was just on my they called me. They went on their honeymoon this morning, and just before I joined, 15 minutes before, they FaceTimed me. They wanted to share with me how cool they're in at a tropical resort, and they wanted to share it with me. And my daughter said, "I know we're not supposed to call during during our honeymoon, but that's the way it is." They wanted to share it with me, and I said, "I'd love to talk to you about this after the webinar with everybody present, show everybody the room and the view you have from your balcony. I think it'll be special." You have to be a part of the solution, which means you can only work on your side of the street. When I go to family therapy, the times I've gone to therapy, family therapy later in my life, I want to talk about. This is not a session where I'm going to talk about my child and their problems. This is a session where I'm going to talk about my problems, my challenges, my weaknesses, my temper, my expectations, my blind spots. I'm going to work on myself. And if my child is going to be put on the hot seat during a therapy session because of the screw ups that they're making in their life, then I want mine. I want to be on the hot seat. I want to show them what I'm asking them to do, to work through difficult, unsolvable problems, to heal, to unravel my own trauma history, my own childhood, my own programming. Do your best not to blame the child's behavior on the other parent. This is important. The more animosity you feel toward the other parent, you run a very significant risk. The more blame, the more animosity, the more negativity, the more criticism, the more hatred, the more anger that you feel and live and communicate consciously or unconsciously about the other parent, you are expressing that toward the child at the same time. The child, even in cases of neglect and abuse, the child still identifies with the other parent. One of the saddest and sweetest and truest quotes that I've ever read, it goes like this. It goes, when a child is abused by a parent, they typically don't stop loving the parent, they stop loving themselves. And when you're expressing or communicating this kind of animosity toward the other parent, the child carries around a part of that in them. It's like a child who has a teddy bear. It's not external. The teddy bear is not an outside thing. The teddy bear is part of the child. The child identifies with it, and they're going to identify with the co-parent. So just know that if you carry that and communicate that in any ways that I'm describing, and you do, it happens, that the child feels it. It gets into the child, and it feels like it's towards them. Let the therapist that you work with do the heavy lifting. And I think what can be difficult when I talk about this, let the therapist do the confronting if confronting is the thing that needs to be done. Let the therapist do the teaching if there's teaching that needs to be done with your co-parenting, because when it comes from you, because you have your own ego in the mix, your own dog in the fight, as I said earlier, when you come to the table with that energy, you're more likely to get the defense. And if you think the therapist isn't pushing hard enough, there's a few reasons that might be. And one of the reasons why your therapist might not be pushing as hard on the co-parent is because the co-parent's not ready to hear it. The co-parent is still wounded. The co-parent still needs healing and compassion, just like you do, just like I do, just like your child does. Another reason is the therapist might not think that the other parent is as far off as you do. It might be your issue that's presenting itself. And if it's obsessive and repetitive and anger and animosity and criticism, if it's all that heavy stuff, it is your issue. The reason they kill teachers sometimes, the reason they killed Socrates, for example, the reason they kill people sometimes is because so many of these mystics and these gurus, these martyrs, so many of them are basically teaching personal accountability. And people respond with, well, what happens with the child who's sexually, physically abused? What happens when somebody murders or tortures? What happens in these extreme cases? And what the guru typically says is it's tremendously painful. There's going to be a lot of grief, a lot of pain, a lot of trauma in the body. And that deserves our attention, our compassion, and our energy. And at the end of the day, like Viktor Frankl talks about after his experience in the concentration camps, at the end of the day, when we are faced with situations over which we have control, the one last bastion, the one last sovereignty of being a human is the ability to deal with it. That it still is our responsible to deal with it. Decide on safety as a minimum, and realize that really what we're looking for is what D.W. Winnicott called good enough parenting. It's silly and it's psychotic to believe there's such a thing as a good parent, because by its definition, a good parent is not bad. But what is realistic is a human parent. And Winnicott talked about a good enough parent, somebody who's trying, somebody who's making them mistake and picking themselves up afterwards, somebody that can make a repair, somebody that is there for the young child and attentive to their needs, and that is capable of negotiating as the child grows and letting go, letting the child be themselves. My daughter and my son-in-law, they had, I think I shared this earlier. They did some things that were traditional and they did some things that weren't. One of the things they did was that was not traditional was they had me and my wife escort my daughter up the aisle instead of the traditional father. My daughter's not very interested in supporting the patriarchy, and I got to tell you, as a dad, there was a bit of an tiny little ego death in there, right? I thought, well, everybody else, why are we changing it now? And what are people going to think about me? Am I going to be less of a man, less of a father? Those thoughts came in my mind. They were in my body when my daughter told me this. But I knew enough that that's my old programming, that that's my old wounding, that that's my own trauma. When, I secretly hoped that my daughter would keep her last name, my name. It would feel special and I would love that. There's a part of me that thought that. But it's not my life. And the fact that they chose neither his name or her name, but came up with a new last name that meant something to both of them, I actually think that probably is the best way. Same feeling I had when I was marrying my wife 25 years ago. And she let me know she was going to be keeping her last name. I had an ego issue with it. And I regret so much not being more supportive to her at the time. I was younger then. The ego was still fragile and running the show more than it is today. I hope in another 25 years, if I get to live that long, I hope I'll continue to make progress on that. So we just try to be good enough. Being right is a problem. Being right and good is a problem. I was explaining at the wedding party to these folks that were asking me about my work. It's the defense that's the problem. When we're up against the defense, that's the problem. We can live with imperfect partners and co-parents and children and friends and bosses and coworkers we can live with imperfect people. And the fact of the matter is we have no other choice because that's the only thing that exists on this planet. But what's difficult to deal with is the defense. The person's need to be right. Your need to be right. My need to be right. That's the thing that we have to unlearn in this work. We have to kill the ego, let it die over and over and over again. The ego is that energy in us that needs to be right. It's the same thing I've been talking about for years about you don't get to be right. You don't get to be good. You don't get to win. You just get to be yourself, which is so much better. And when I use the word ego, I'm just borrowing from a certain field of psychology. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about that energy. I think that it's really a subtle distinction and important to separate out your need from your child's need. To understand that you might have an idea of the work that they need to do because it's partly your work. You might have unresolved hurt or anger or resentment toward your co-parent. And the child might not be ready to do that work or even need to do that work. So it's really important. I've heard a lot of parents stumble into this trap of thinking my child needs to talk about the abuse, my child needs to talk about the abandonment with my co-parent, with my ex-partner. That might be your issue. And it's not wrong issue. It's not a bad issue. It just is yours and not theirs. And at least In most cases, the child isn't ready for that. It doesn't feel safe to do that for them for whatever reason. Maybe they feel like if they do, they're going to be betraying their parent, or they're going to lose their parent, or their parent, they're afraid that their parent will go away or will punish them. In co-parenting therapy, I encourage couples and therapists to focus on shared goals, to listen and listen and listen more, to negotiate. And lastly, to let go or don't let go. If you don't want to let go, if that idea, that concept, that invitation just rubs you wrong, don't. And then tell me about it. Let's see what happens as you don't let go. Some of the don'ts I wanted to list off tonight, some of the things that to not do, and I put on the slide. Most will fail at these, and maybe a better way to say it is we will all fail at some of these, some more than others. Talking with your child about the other parent. The second bullet point I wrote on here was imagining or thinking that you're not leaking. You are leaking. Leaking, leaking. Coming out sideways. The energy is there. And when you fantasize because your ego needs you to be good and right and not bad, that you're not leaking, you are leaking even more. Be careful not to let your child replace the parent. And maybe more importantly, let the child not be relied upon as a source of support for your ego, for your defenses, for your need to be good, for your emotional closeness and intimacy. That is not their task. And the risk that is run when the child replaces the parent is they will lose themselves. They will not be who they need to be and who they are. I was just reading a quote this evening from Oscar Wilde. I'm going to share it tomorrow on my social media after all the pictures of the wedding pass by. And Oscar Wilde wrote, "Disobedience, in the eyes of anyone who has read history, is man's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made, through disobedience and through rebellion." I mean, that's a pretty difficult idea. It's true. I was recently, where was I? I was somewhere where we were talking about, it was as we were gathering in family from both sides, we were talking about parents today, and my wonderful, beautiful new friend from my son-in-law's life, Malachi is his name, asked the question. He's so good at this. He said, "What do you guys think of how older generation find it difficult to change and difficult to adapt?" And one of the older people there said, "Well," and it started to describe and criticize the younger generation and what's going on today in social media and all the specific things that they saw going wrong with the world. And when it was my turn to share, I said, I don't, I want to be the first generation, or at least a person in my generation, to not believe that the upcoming generation is screwing everything up. Virtually every generation has thought that the children and the current culture and what's going on, the printing press was thought to be a threat to humanity, to civilization, to virtue. And there are quotes. I have a presentation that I give on this. There are quotes that go back as long as we have recorded history, where people are saying things that now we take for granted, and now we look at in very positive ways. That people think that part of the difficulty is that this generation is changing. They're not doing it well all the time. They're making lots of mistakes, but that's what human beings do. And so you see how hard that is to then be a parent and give a parenting talk like this when I'm encouraging or normalizing so much of the mess of it. It's very difficult. Don't depend on the child for their emotional support or validation for the pain you experience with the other parent, from the other parent. A very common mistake I see is because so many people didn't feel heard and seen by their parents, they go too far. It turns into a democracy. Now, I'm not encouraging dictatorship either, but I'm encouraging a strong sense of self, the development of a sense of a self and a self-awareness and being who you are, as authentic as you can be. And sometimes because parents are afraid, they see the pain or distress in the child when the child isn't getting what they want or the child is going through difficulty. The parent sees that as their own failure. And because they see it as their own failure, they end up giving to the child something that they think will give the child the sense of being seen and heard in ways that they never were. And they end up losing themselves. And the child has way too much power and feels way too responsible for the parents' insecurities. Be careful. Try to avoid using them to meet your needs, especially the ego's need to be good or right. Divorce or marital conflict is not all of the problem, nor is it none of the problem. It's some of the problem. It's a part of it. And your job is to look at it and see what it is, and look at specifically your part of the street, even when you see yourself being the good one and the other guy being the bad one. Like I said, allow the therapist to do the heavy lifting. Don't be your co-parent's teacher if you can avoid it. I talked about the idea of the unified front. More importantly, is to be overt and respectful, honest about the differences. Keep the divorce details to yourself. It's not your child's job to heal or attend to your pain or where you were wronged in the divorce. This is maybe the next point that is maybe the most important. Watch out for polarizing. I see my co-parent is the nurturer, but not very strict and always not being clear or being consistent with boundaries. So I become more and more and more boundaried. I become the bad cop. They are the good cop. And we get farther and farther away. Think of a teeter-totter. And let's imagine the other person on the other end of the teeter-totter has the same body weight that you do. If they move back, for you to be in balance, you've got to move back until you're miles away from each other. And then you're parenting, not even from an authentic place. You're parenting to try to fix or balance something out. And you've just become a fraction, a sliver of who you really are. And what happens if you take a step in is you get out of balance in that teeter-totter of life. You might have to take the first step. You can only do what you can do. I've said over the years that I don't like co-parenting questions, because if you have a co-parent who's not participating in the work, not doing their own work, who's sabotaging the efforts, you are fighting a battle with one hand tied behind your back. There's no way around that. There's no way to look at that differently. You are fighting, but we know this. We know that one secure relationship, and the secure relationship, by the way, is determined or rests on the foundation of your work about you. That if there's only one parent that has this secure relationship with the child, it makes all the difference in the world and can mitigate a lot of other complex or big T traumas. I typically will encourage people to go. Co-parenting therapy and couples therapy and family therapy is more advanced than individual therapy. Because in an ideal situation, let's just use co-parenting or couples therapy as the example, just two people in the session, two clients in the session. At best, half of the session is going to be specifically addressing your needs. At best, right? If you're lucky. And it might be less. And definitely will feel like less. And the 50% that's being spent on attending to your co-parent or your partner's needs will feel like abandonment and insanity to you. That the therapist doesn't know what they're doing and that we are way off track. Like I mentioned earlier, you're not the one to vent to. It's important that you let your child know in certain situations when it starts to feed into your own feelings that maybe they need to talk to somebody else or a therapist. Again, if we're talking about child abuse, that's different. I'm just talking about venting in the normal frustrations of life. And get ready. Get ready. I mean, the highest maybe evolution of all this work is get ready for the time when your child is going to be complaining about you. That's what the work is that you are healed and whole enough that you are willing to be cast as the villain in your child's story. And when you can do that, they can move through their feelings. They can move through their feelings, or maybe more appropriately said, their feelings can move through them and they won't stay stuck. They won't fixate. They'll grow. When they hate you, it's okay. It's something to listen to. Doesn't mean you necessarily have to change anything you're doing. Sometimes you might want to, but let them feel it. It's the only way for them. People ask me all the time, "How do I get my child to forgive me?" Or what if my child doesn't forgive me? Or, people, I sent my child to therapy and now they resent me for it. My thought is, let them be mad. You your need for them not to be mad is the trauma. It's the defense. It's about you. And when you can let them be mad, truly, really let them be mad, even empathize or even validate their anger, their complaints about or towards you, they are more likely to move through the feeling, have the feeling move through them, and they will want to be around you more because then they can be themselves. Now they're dealing with an adult. Couple things about step parenting. I'll just say this. The greatest gift of a step parent is sometimes is their clarity. They have an outside perspective on the inside. They have enough distance to be objective. That is their greatest strength. And it is their greatest weakness because parenting a child is not objective. That old saying that the child is the heart that is beating outside of your body. The minute you have a child, there were some young parents that were here this weekend, some of my new family members, and we were talking about how absolutely overwhelmingly consuming having a new child is. Your whole life changes. Your whole meaning changes. And yes, a step parent might have clarity. Be humble about it. Be humble about it. If you can't retain your compassion, if your objectivity gets so clear that it becomes sharp and cutting, now we're talking about your issue. Now we're talking about your lack of humility. That's what I'll say about step parenting. But single parents, I think the most difficult thing is the parentification of the child. Try to make any blurring of parenting boundaries because sometimes in single parent families, children have to do adult things. It's real. They have to take on roles sometimes that parents might. They might have to babysit the younger siblings, and that's just a simple example. The list goes on. Try to make those overt and clear and temporary and limited to a certain context. They are not your partner, and though it might feel good and satisfying to place them in that role, it comes at the great cost of themselves. With parental alienation, I think there's nothing more I want to say about parental alienation than what I've already said. You just have to do your work. Show up, play the long game. If it rises to the level that you think legal intervention applies, consult with a lawyer. But after that, or if it doesn't rise to that level, you're playing the long game. Keep a journal. Write letters to your child and keep them. Show up when you can. And when distance is asked for, requested, demanded by the adult child, honor it. It's the only way that I know. It's very simplistic, and there's a lot, of course, more specific situations, but it's the way it's. If our children can leave freely, if they can leave us freely, they'll come back. But if they can't leave us freely, we need them to need us. If I needed my daughter to keep the Reedy last name, she wouldn't have called me tonight. That's as simple as I can put it. If I would have needed her to take care of me at the cost of what she needed, I wouldn't have received a FaceTime call just after they landed in their hotel, just after they arrived in the hotel, where she and her husband wanted to show me the view from their balcony and the stories of the wedding. It looks like passivity sometimes. It really does. The parenting that I think about and that I do as I get older, it looks like I'm doing nothing sometimes or not doing enough. But I can't tell you the amount of work, the work that it's taken to do this, the faith that I've had to develop. And I'm not talking about religious faith. I'm talking about the faith in life, the faith in what I know and what I teach, what I believe, what my heart tells me, the willingness to die over and over again and not run away. My take-home messages for this evening are: you have to understand your own madness. You have to understand why you picked your partner. And you might imagine that they changed. Maybe they did, but usually they didn't. Usually it was there in the beginning. You just couldn't see it. I always say, when somebody tells me that their ex-partner, ex-spouse is a narcissist, I say to them, well, that's interesting. But what's really fascinating to me is, why did you pick a narcissist? Because the answer to that question is much, much more important than the specific description of the pathology of your co-parent or your partner. Shift from being good, trying to be good, to being a person. That's what our myths teach us, by the way. The idea in Pinocchio to become a real boy, that's what it means. Be a human. Develop a mature love, not a love that's based on ego and taking, but one that's based on capacity. One that's based on, it's your job to take care of yourself and to show up to the relationship as whole as possible, as well as possible. Not to come to the child or the co-parent begging for your needs, but to go away and get happy. That's why therapy, individual therapy, can be so valuable. You go to therapy so that you can show up to the people that you love. As I end the podcast, as I will this evening, that you coming to this is an indication that you're willing to do your work, and it's about you, and it makes all the difference in the world. There used to be this quote on the cover of the Systematic Training in Effective Parenting, the Step Parenting Manual, very famous, popular, still even today, very relevant parent curriculum. And the quote on the cover of their manual was, the trick or the secret in parenting teenagers is to focus on changing yourself, not the teenager. Understand what your project is, not their project. It's really easy to see other people's projects. Take it from someone who does it for a living. Much easier to see what other people's projects are than to know and own mine. Ideally, if you have a co-parent that you're married to and you intend to try to stay married, learn to fall in love with their dilemma. You're they came with baggage. In fact, they came with baggage, which, what my experience tells me, was part of what what attracted you to them. So falling in love with their dilemma, with their issues, is in part falling in love with yourself. Fall in love with your own history. Understand the difference between giving and taking. A lot of people think they're giving when they're really taking. When we share our feelings, we are taking. We are asking for people to hear us. When we are listening, for example, we are typically, if done in the way that I'm thinking, we are giving. We are holding space. So learning the difference between talking and listening, giving and taking, is important. My daughter and my son-in-law, they created a little newspaper. I wrote an article about the relationship. My wife wrote an article about their relationship. The other parents wrote about their individuals, and there were and they had a little section on divorce. And what they said was, we know that divorce for some people is thought of as a horrible thing, but what it's done for us, they wrote, was it's given us more people to love. There are people in our lives who wouldn't have been without divorce. It was raining yesterday as leading up to the wedding. It was drizzling and cold. And as the people came up to talk about my daughter, they were saying things like, and her husband, they were saying things like, they are the best of us. They're the best of us because they accept what life is. And you can't have the joy without the pain. And divorce is painful, and it's a loss, and it's grief, and it's not ideal, and it's not why we get married. And sometimes it happens. And that's not the end of the story. That's not the end of the book. In Al-Anon, we learned the saying, stay on your side of the street, focus on your side of the street, stay in your lane is a more popular version of that. Work on your stuff. You be the safe one for the child. You be the adult. Take care of yourself. Go to therapy. If your partner is not willing to go to therapy, go to therapy anyway. And if they're still not willing to go to therapy, double your therapy. Add an hour for every hour you think they need. That's my intervention. That's my invitation for you this evening. In Al-Anon, They have the saying that what people think about me is none of my business. And what you think about them is none of their business. That comes with it. And lastly, what your child thinks about, what you think about your child, ultimately, it's none of their business. For them to grow as a spiritual, emotionally mature person, they have got to throw off the shackles of what you think they should be doing. If they live in service of making you proud and making you happy, they will have lived an unlived life. All right, folks. We ask all current parents to go to 6 of any of the following 12-step support groups: Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. You can also go to RefugeRecovery.org, which is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program, less of an emphasis on a higher power if that helps you. And the National Alliance on Mental Illness also have classes and resources in your local community. We have recently partnered with Other Parents Like Me. Other Parents Like Me is an online platform built on the foundation of parents supporting parents. They provide 17 weekly Zoom meetings designed for caregivers of teens, young adults facing mental health issues, led by trained and peer parent facilitators. It's an authentic and safe community. For a 1-month premium membership for free, use the code FINDINGYOU. And with our partnership with OPLM, Other Parents Like Me, you'll get that first month for free, premium membership. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, which is the parent that's willing to look at themselves and their part in things. The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You are available on Amazon and Audible. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work or to accelerate the work that you're doing, I can't think of a better investment in your work than our Finding You workshop, our Finding You Therapy Intensive. June 19th through 23rd, there's 1 spot left, so it's going to fill up in a few days. If you're interested, jump on it. If we need to open up a second one, we will. July 24th after that, and then, of course, the online July 21st through 23rd is available to all of you and free if you are a parent of an Evoke student, a current parent of an Evoke student. Like I mentioned earlier, I'll be in New York City area, July 31st through August 4th. The only Finding You that I'll be running in 2024 will be that one, July 31st through August 4th. Contact intensive@evoketherapy.com for more information. We have weekly support groups for our wilderness parents and our alumni parents. May 23rd is that next offering at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. And for our alumni only, people that are a little farther along, the next offering, we have one of those a month, June 17th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. For our intensives and coaching alumni and current clients, June 10th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time is your support group. Contact support groups at evoketherapy.com. Go to our website or use the QR code. If you'd like to work with a therapist or a coach virtually, contact our coaching services. Coaching@evoketherapy.com is the email. Go to our website. They can work with you all over the country, all over the world. You can be matched up with one of our coaches. All these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just go to wherever you consume your podcast and search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. You can also listen to them on soundcloud.com on your computer. You can also watch the video rebroadcast of these on our YouTube channel, Evoke's YouTube channel. You can find Evoke Therapy Program and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on X, Threads, and Instagram using the handles @Evoke Therapy and @Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can find Evoke Therapy Intensives on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives, and on Facebook. You can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog has wonderful content each week. I'll be back about 2 days from now, about 48 hours from now, where I'll take live questions. If you have any questions at any time, any requests, suggestions, you can always email us at webinar@evoketherapy.com. That's webinar@evoketherapy.com. Those questions will go to the top of the queue. I'll answer them live on air, and then you'll have them. So our next session is this Thursday, May 23rd at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. That'll be the live Q&A for the parents and alumni of our programs. And for any of you, it will be the podcast that will come out the next day. Thank you for joining me. I hope this was a helpful point of contact and perspective. And as always, for on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, thanks for showing up and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you on Thursday. Take care. Bye-bye.